The year was 1878, and the silence of the high meadows was a living thing. For Esther Weston, it was the only thing. Her cabin was a lonely speck in a vast, empty wilderness. 2 days' ride from a town that had mostly forgotten she even existed. Her life was small. It was the chop of an axe, the wind in the pines, and the ghosts, so many ghosts. Esther was a widow. Her husband, Walter, had been gone for 2 winters. A fever took him, fast and mean. He left her this land. And a loneliness so deep it felt like a stone in her chest. She learned to carry it. She learned to mend fences, hunt for her food, and stare into the fire at night without crying. She wasn't strong by choice. She was strong because she had to be. Her world was a quiet agreement she'd made with fate. She expected nothing. She asked for nothing. She was a woman frozen in time, trapped by a past she couldn't change and a future she couldn't imagine. Then one afternoon, the silence broke. She was by the creek, gathering stones for her garden, when she saw it. A smudge of color on the green bank. Something that didn't belong. At first, she thought it was a deer. Fallen. Broken. But as she got closer, her heart started hammering against her ribs. The shape wasn't an animal. It was a man. He was a Cheyenne warrior, beads in his dark hair, buckskin leggings. He was lying face down, one arm stretched toward the water. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his back. A wound, still weeping blood into the dirt. He was perfectly still. For a long moment, Esther froze. Every warning she'd ever heard screamed at her. Turn around! Run! He was the enemy. The savage. The reason good folk bolted their doors at night. But as she looked at him, another feeling took over. He wasn't a threat. He was a man, dying on her land. And leaving him here was a death sentence. Hesitantly, she knelt beside him. She pressed her fingers to his neck. She was looking for a pulse. And she found one. Faint. Thready. But it was there. In that single moment, a choice was made. The quiet, resigned life of Esther Weston was over. She couldn't let him die. With a strength she didn't know she had, she heaved his dead weight onto her shoulders, and she started the long walk back to the cabin. With every single step, her world was changing, and she had no idea how much danger she was carrying home. For 3 days, the man was just a body lost in fever. Esther moved around him like a ghost in her own home. The old rifle Walter left her was never far from her hand. She'd dragged him onto her own bed, the only soft place in the cabin, and set to work. She tore her own sheets for bandages, boiled water to clean the deep, jagged gash in his side. A hunter's knife, she guessed. She brewed bitter willow bark tea and forced it past his cracked lips. The cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with his ragged breathing, with the low moans that escaped him when the fever dreams got bad. She wasn't nursing a man. She was fighting a death. But all the while, a question echoed in her mind. What have I done? What trouble have I brought to my door? When he finally woke up, it was sudden. His eyes snapped open, dark and deep as a forest pool. They locked onto her. The fever was gone, but something sharp and intelligent was there in its place. He didn't speak. He just watched. His gaze followed her every move as she stoked the fire. It was the look of a wolf, cornered and wounded, trying to decide if she was friend or foe. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was a wire, stretched tight between them, humming with suspicion. They had no words for each other. So they built a language of gestures. When she brought him broth, he'd watch her hands, her face, before taking the bowl. When he needed to rise, he'd give a slight nod. She'd help him, her touch firm, professional. He'd accept, his face a stoic mask. It was an uneasy truce. He was a warrior, even lying wounded, and she was a lone white woman. He didn't know if she was his savior or his jailer. His strength came back slowly. First, he could sit up on his own. Then, he was walking, limping around the small room. His eyes took in every detail: the worn rocking chair, the small shelf of Walter's books, the faded photograph on the mantelpiece, a smiling man and woman. He started to contribute. He took a piece of kindling and her knife and carved a new, better handle for her water bucket. He found her struggling with a snare and, with a few quick movements, showed her a better knot. He never spoke, but his actions were a language she was starting to understand. They ate their meals at the same table, in silence. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a space they shared. And in that space, Esther started to talk. She knew he couldn't understand her words. But she talked anyway. The words just poured out. She told him about Walter, about their dreams for this land, about the crushing loneliness. She confessed it all to the quiet man across the table. He would just listen, his dark eyes fixed on her face, and she could have sworn she saw something in them. Not pity, empathy. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the sorrow. A few nights later, a cougar came circling the cabin, drawn by the scent of smoked meat. Its scream ripped through the night, and Esther grabbed for the rifle, her hands trembling. Before she could unbolt the door, the Cheyenne was on his feet. He took a burning brand from the fire. Ignoring her panicked look, he opened the door and stepped out into the blackness. There was a furious snarl, a shower of sparks, and then the heavy sound of the cougar retreating into the trees. He came back inside and bolted the door. He had put himself between her and the danger, without hesitation. In that moment, he wasn't a wounded man anymore. He was a protector. He was a partner in her survival. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. They came out of the wilderness like a bad omen. Two men, trappers. Their faces were weathered and mean, and their eyes held a calculating glint. Amos and Garrett Callahan, brothers who saw the world as theirs for the taking. They'd seen the smoke from her chimney. "Just checking on the widow," Amos said, his voice a greasy drawl. He leaned on her porch rail, his eyes crawling over her. "Gets lonely out here for a woman." Esther stood in the doorway, her rifle in her hands. "I'm fine, Mr. Callahan. I don't need anything." Garrett, the bigger of the two, peered past her into the cabin. "Smells like you got company," he grunted. He'd seen the extra bowl on the table. He'd smelled the herbs she used for the warrior's wound. "Got a secret, have we, Mrs. Weston?" The air turned thick with menace. Before Esther could answer, a shadow fell across the doorway. The warrior stepped up beside her. He was unarmed, bandages still wrapped around his chest. But he stood with a stillness that was more threatening than any weapon. The Callahan's eyes went wide, first with shock, then with a vile, greedy light. "Well, I'll be," Amos spat, his hand dropping to his pistol. "Hiding out with an Indian lover, are you? We heard about a Cheyenne buck getting cut up by the river. Looks like we found him." This was it. Her private act of compassion had just become a public crime. In their eyes, she wasn't a healer. She was a traitor. The warrior understood the poison in their looks, if not their words. He took a half step in front of Esther, a silent, protective gesture that just made the brothers angrier. "You best send him out," Garrett snarled, drawing his own weapon, "or we'll burn this cabin down around both of you." He was holding a strange-looking knife, its handle wrapped in familiar leather. Esther's blood ran cold. She recognized it. It was Walter's hunting knife, the one he'd been buried with. What was it doing in this man's hand? The brothers eventually backed away, but their threats hung in the air. "We'll be back," Amos promised, "and we'll bring friends. The town will want to hear all about this." As they rode off, Esther's mind was reeling. Walter's knife. How? It didn't make any sense. The warrior knew he had to leave. His presence was a danger to her. As he stood by the door, ready to go, he turned and touched her forehead, a silent gesture of gratitude and farewell. But when he opened the door, the Callahan brothers were standing there. They hadn't gone for help. They'd just waited. Garrett lunged, grabbing for Esther, and in that instant, the grieving widow vanished. With a cry of rage, Esther swung her rifle, cracking the stock against Garrett's jaw. The fight was short and brutal. The warrior moved like a striking snake, disarming Amos with a swift, blinding movement. They fought together, a seamless, unspoken partnership. They didn't kill the Callahans. They broke them, leaving them battered and whimpering in the dirt. "Go," Esther gasped, pointing the rifle, "and if you ever come back, I won't be so merciful." The trappers scrambled away into the twilight. The victory was theirs, but it didn't feel like one. His departure was now certain. He placed a hand over his heart, then extended it toward her. A gesture of honor, a promise. Then he limped into the darkening forest and was gone. Esther stood in the doorway of her silent cabin, the rifle heavy in her hands. She was alone again, but as she looked down at the dirt, she saw something glinting. It was Walter's knife, dropped in the struggle. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and that's when she saw it. Scratched crudely into the leather of the sheath was a map, and a symbol she didn't recognize, a coiled snake. Her husband hadn't just been a farmer, he'd been hiding a secret, and she was beginning to think that secret was what had gotten him killed, and that the man she'd just saved was somehow at the very heart of it. The seasons turned. The world went from gold to white, and Esther Weston lived with the consequences. The Callahan brothers had spread their poison. When Esther made the long ride to town for supplies, she was met with cold shoulders, hostile glares. The whispers followed her everywhere. The widow who harbored a savage, the traitor. The isolation she had once felt from geography was now a wall of prejudice built by the fear and judgment of her neighbors. But something in her had changed. The passive, grieving woman was gone. She met their contempt with a quiet dignity that infuriated them even more. The silence in her cabin was different too. It was filled with the memory of him, not a ghost, but a presence, a strength she could draw on. She thought often about the knife, about the map. She searched Walter's old trunk, the one she hadn't opened in 2 years. Under a pile of his worn shirts, she found it. A leather-bound journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. Walter's neat handwriting filled the pages. At first, it was just the mundane record of ranch life. But then, the entries changed. He wrote of meeting the Callahans, of a deal, of a silver lode, deep in the Cheyennes' sacred lands. He wrote about a treaty stone, a holy relic that marked the boundary. He wrote about a Cheyenne warrior who guarded it, a warrior who carried a token that was the key to finding the mine, a token marked with a coiled snake. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Walter, her quiet, hard-working husband, had been a thief. He and the Callahans had planned to steal the tribe's silver, and the warrior she'd saved. He was the guardian they had tried to kill. Walter hadn't died of a fever. The journal's last entry was chillingly clear. The Callahans are getting greedy. They don't want to share. I think they mean to kill me. Her husband had been murdered by his own partners, and the wounded man she'd found by the creek wasn't some random victim. He was the survivor of their treachery. The grief she felt was a new and terrible kind. Grief for the man she thought she knew, and a cold, hard rage began to grow in its place. A rage for the warrior she now knew was named Voken. One day in early spring, she saw riders on the ridge, a large party. She grabbed her rifle, her heart pounding. She thought the town had finally sent a posse. But these were not settlers. They were Cheyenne warriors. And at their head rode a man in the magnificent regalia of a chief, a full headdress of eagle feathers, a breastplate of polished bone. As he drew closer, her breath caught. It was Voken. He halted his horse a short distance away. Another warrior rode forward. "Our Chief Voken sends greetings to the woman of the strong heart," the man said in halting English. "His father has journeyed to the spirit world. He is now chief of our people." Esther could only stare. The wounded fugitive had returned as a king. Vulcan dismounted and walked toward her. He spoke, and the warrior translated. He says he never forgot your courage. He says you saved his life, and then you fought beside him. His people value honor. You have shown the greatest honor. Vulcan's gaze was serious, but profoundly gentle. He says a chief must have a strong woman by his side. A woman with a heart as brave as any warrior. A woman who knows how to heal and how to fight. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. He asks you to leave this place of sorrow. He asks you to come with him, to be his wife, to be a mother to his people. He offers you a home where you will be honored, not shunned. Before she could even process the proposal, a new group of riders appeared on the opposite ridge. White men, led by the Callahan brothers, and this time they had brought the whole town with them. They carried rifles and torches. "There she is!" Garrett Callahan yelled, pointing. "The traitor! And there's the savage that killed her husband!" It was a lie. A monstrous, perfect lie. They had twisted the story, painted her as an accomplice to her own husband's murder. Vulcan's warriors moved instantly, forming a protective line in front of him and Esther. The two groups faced each other across the meadow, an inch away from a massacre, but Esther didn't raise her rifle. She held up Walter's journal. "This is my husband's book," she shouted, her voice ringing out in the tense silence. "It tells the truth. It says he made a deal with the Callahans to steal Cheyenne's silver. It says they murdered him when he wouldn't cut them in." A murmur went through the townsfolk. They looked from her to the sneering faces of the Callahan brothers. "That's a lie," Amos screamed. "She's been bewitched by him." "Then how?" Esther's voice was cold as ice. "Did you have his knife? The one he was buried with? The one with the map to the silver carved on it?" The color drained from Garrett's face. He had been caught. And the townsfolk, seeing the truth in his panic, began to lower their rifles. They were not here to help thieves and murderers. Vulcan stepped forward. He held up a small, flat stone marked with a coiled snake. "They tried to take this from me," he said, his own English clear and strong. He had understood far more than she ever knew. "The key to the mine. They left me for dead. This woman saved me. Her husband was a thief, but she is a woman of honor." The fight was over. The Callahans, abandoned by the very people they had inflamed, tried to flee. But Vulcan's warriors were faster. Their justice would be swift. Tears welled in Esther's eyes, tears of release. She looked at the lonely cabin, her prison. She looked at the town that had scorned her. And then she looked at Vulcan, the chief, the man who saw her for who she truly was. She didn't need a translator. She didn't need any more words. She walked forward and placed her hand in his. A smile, the first true smile in years, touched her lips. As she rode away from the cabin, beside her chief, she did not look back. She was no longer Esther Weston, the lonely widow. She was a woman who had uncovered a dark secret and forged a new truth. She was a queen in her own right, riding toward the dawn. What did you think of Esther's journey from a grieving widow to a warrior queen? If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got another one coming for you next week.